Hello, everyone. This is Rick, and welcome to Astral Club. This is Vacation to Amphibia. Before we get into it, just want to mention Patreon. If you'd like to support Astral Club on Patreon, you can do so. You get advanced episodes on Sunday, a library of downloaded episodes, a Patreon email where we can talk back and forth, and a new chat room for patrons. And if you're interested, there is a link in the description. Next up, private lessons. If you'd like a lesson to learn how to astral project, more than glad to work with you. All you have to do is go down to the description section and you'll find an email there. Just send me a short email requesting more info on lessons and I'll fire that off to you. Let's get started. Now, before I get into the background of this episode and what actually happened just last night to me, I just want to let you know that normally I edit out extraneous material. When some part of time where nothing happens, or when it's a situation that where I fail over and over again to get somewhere. I figured let's just filter that out. And I think it's good for the storytelling end of things. However, what it does, and I've seen this, is put out a false idea that Rick goes everywhere he wants to go on the first try. And that's just not so a lot of the time. And in this particular case, it took me a couple of weeks to get back to this planet that I've named Amphibia. And there was a number of false starts. I even flashed back to the World War III dimension real quick before I willed myself out of that again. So there was some struggle. So I just wanted to mention this so that you know when you astral project, don't feel bad when you don't always succeed on your first try of going exactly where or when you want to go, because it happens to the best of us. So after 2 weeks of trying, I finally returned to the ident of this planet I call Amphibia. Now, this ident not only has a spatial component to it, but it has a time component. Because when I originally arrived at this planet, it was still in an early stage of life. There wasn't anything that I considered self-aware life as of yet. So I progressed many millions of years into the future. So at present, this planet exists, but not in the advanced state that I saw it in because I traveled very far into the future. So just keep that in mind, that an ident quite often isn't just a spatial coordinate. It's also a time coordinate, especially in cases where you had a time travel component. And the reason I traveled in this case was for two reasons. Number one, because I wanted to get to a civilization that was self-aware. And number two, as I go very far into the future, as I've demonstrated numerous times, I get a body of sorts that can be seen by people in the third dimension. And I can interact with the populace as if I had a body. This body has the same kind of awareness that my astral self does. However, it doesn't feel pain. It's just essentially my astral body in a form that can be seen by other living beings. Now, as I mentioned, I went to this twice before. I'm not going to go through both episodes again, obviously. All I can tell you is that I'm going to leave the previous episodes in the description. 4 years ago, I journeyed to that alien planet, progressed myself, and I called it Astral Journey to an Alien Civilization. And I described my experiences of being in that civilization. A couple years later, I returned to Amphibia on a mission which I had very mixed feelings about. I was told by the council at that point that they'd had a request from some representative of the planet, they didn't get into details, that they wanted to remove the sacrifice, the intelligent sacrifice of the amphibians to their particular gods that were in charge of the return of the waters. At first, I turned them down because I didn't like the idea of interfering in their religion, even if it had a component that I found objectionable. But then they played a little dirty using my psychology against me. I have one major weakness, that is a protective spirit, especially around young children, especially around young girls, because they reminded me and remind me to this day of my daughter when she was young. And that's just a weak spot for me, if you want to call it that. I have a hard time saying no. And they said that Rose, which is the name I gave the small female who proudly showed me around her room in her family's cavern, had been selected as part of this human sacrifice to ensure that the waters, which were nothing more than meltwaters from a mountain range they had very far in the distance, that those waters would properly melt and then flow as a river of fresh water to them, which preserves their civilization. And it's a regular cycle. I can't say that it happens once a year because I don't know what a year is there, but it's a regular situation where there's a lot of water, kind of like a Nile flooding situation, and it's a big part of their civilization as to how they grow their crops and how they feed their families. However, if that doesn't flow properly or it's a weak flood, then it can cause major problems in their society. And they have a Return of the Waters celebration, which I watched. That was part of the first episode. I apologize for the first episode because I was so excited after I had the experience that I actually wrote the whole thing out. So it kind of sounds like I'm reading out of a book, because I kind of was. I've avoided doing that again. It's in exchange for this type of normal speaking voice, as if I'm just telling you a story, as we're sitting around a campfire type of way of doing things. I think it flows a little bit better, although sometimes I miss out on some details because I'm just going off of memory then at this particular stage. Okay, with all that said as a preamble, I just want to mention that, as I said, the first time I went to the civilization, I just got introduced to it. I thought the beings there were great. They were amphibian in nature. If you look at the icon in the little picture inside the yellow icon for this particular episode, you'll see a picture that's not that different from how they actually look. Now, they average more around 5 feet tall. They're not quite as tall as that picture might show you. And they don't have the six-pack or the strong breast that the picture shows you, which is quite frankly mammalian in nature, I think. No, instead, their body is a little bit more amorphous. They're black in that their skin color is dark, which I think helps them to deal with the sun in some way. Their sun is very warm, very hot. They actually have, I believe, 2 different suns. I think that was a world that had 2 suns. At any rate, it would get very hot there, and when they had their dry seasons, they would wait for these returns of the waters. So I saw that in the first time I visited them. The second time I went there, I was confronted with this sacrifice situation. And the only reason I was there was because I felt bad for this little girl that I had named after my own daughter. To make matters real quick, I think you should really review the episodes, but I found a way which I thought was a good compromise that allowed religious tradition to exist without actually causing the horrible death of a large number of their children, which they believed was a way to bring back these waters. So let's kind of start from there. And I'll add some description, but don't expect a complete everything from this episode because these 2 previous episodes have a lot of information to them. At any rate, finally, I was able to materialize, hovering high above the planet. And I could see that there was a city below, which is the city I had been in before. And I could feel myself going down to the the cavern, as they called it, of the family that had befriended me. Now, when I visited there previously, I was certainly very popular and the object of a lot of curiosity, but I wasn't the first alien to ever visit there. So it's not like my presence in and of itself disturbed their view of the universe. They're a fairly primitive people, but they have the understanding that somehow there are other worlds scattered throughout the stars and that there are other beings on them. It's a weird concept to them, but they accept it because of everything that they have seen themselves. So I think I was the first human ever to get there because I got that feeling. Naturally, I don't speak their language. I use telepathy, which can be tricky when you're dealing with aliens. But I think I did a decent job of getting at least a pretty good idea. I'm sure lots of stuff went over my head last time. But I descended to exactly where the cavern had been when I last was there. And I arrived, and it was dark outside. So I kind of kept myself in the shadows. I didn't want to announce myself to everyone at first. And I found myself scratching on the door to this cavern. That's how they ask to gain entrance. They don't knock. They have these longer claws, so their scratches sound a lot more, louder than mine did. But after a little while, I felt a seal break, and the door opened up, and there, instead of the mother who I had met on previous journeys, I found a being which I identified as Rose, but she had grown. So somehow my time coordinates must be off because I'd gone years into their future where Rose was now an adult and she recognized me instantly. And when she did, I could hear her sort of, I guess croaking would be a way of describing how happy she was to see me. And she immediately reached out her hand, and I reached mine out, and we both kind of touched our palms together. And I think that's just one of the ways that they extend greetings. She then closed the seal to the outside, and they have like a little chamber in the middle that acts as a way of sealing in moisture. So the outside lock is closed and sealed, and then the inside lock is opened to the main chamber of their cavern. From the outside, it just looks like a series of igloos that are kind of joined together by large tunnels. But on the inside, it had the appearance of a cavern, of a cave. The light was low, and there was some light sources coming from the walls. I think it may have been some sort of naturally phosphorus or phosphorescent type of rocks, because that's where the light was coming. For our eyes, it would have been like, why is it so dark in here? But for their eyes, I think it was very comfortable and certainly very moist. Their skin is amphibian in nature, is how I would describe it. As I said, they're about 5 foot tall. They have two arms that are webbed. They don't really have distinct figures. It's a web, and then they have feet, which are also kind of, you could tell they were part-time swimming flippers as well. They don't walk with as much grace as we humans do, but they swim like fish. And the central part of any home crèche or home cavern is their pool, and it's usually somewhere around 12 feet or so deep, which I think is somewhere around 4 meters. It's just enough to get in there and swim around. they have this slime, I guess you might want to call it, layer over top their skin, which helps to protect it from their fierce sun. Obviously, when they came upon land and started living on land, they still had this skin which they had to keep moist, because if not, it cracks, and that's a big problem. We wouldn't want our skin cracking either. So they've got the darker skin. They've got this slime protective layer, and they wear clothing. And I know this is something I don't always talk about, because to me I don't care about that stuff, but I know there are people who do, and their clothing really are. Imagine a type of shift that is made out of these fronds. Imagine sort of palm fronds, but the vegetable part of these fronds, they have an inside that was slick. There seemed to be moisture on the inside of these things. On the outside, they were very dry and very protective. So they would sew these things into a protective garment, which they would then clothe themselves whenever they had to go outside. Wherever you go in other people's caverns or homes, or you go into the public spaces, they've always got some sort of a pool there to allow the individual to refresh themselves and to make sure that their body maintains its moistness. I must have arrived pretty late, because she was the only one who wasn't in a sleeping chamber sleeping. So we sat there and quietly communicated telepathically back and forth. And one of my big questions was, where was her mother? I was keen on meeting her again, because she was a very powerful being in the town. She had some sort of civic responsibility, which had people's respect. But I was told by Rose that she had passed on, which was not the type of word that she used. It was more like she's graduated. I can't come up with the exact. Their attitude about this is not like ours. They see it as a return home more than a place where there should be a lot of sadness and weeping. It just seemed like it was a natural thing. So she told it to me, and I didn't sense the type of grief that would typically happen with us. And so, I think I felt worse than anybody did, which she had a kind of a hard time understanding. But she did say that she'd like to invite me to the ceremony, which was happening. And as a matter of fact, she said she had been, I guess the best word would be praying for my return for some time now. And that she was so glad that I had returned at her request, so that I could attend this particular religious ceremony, which was obviously important to her and probably their civilization. I humored her, thinking, let her have the credit. Although who knows if on some level I just suddenly came up with this idea I thought on my own. But there you go. So she invited me, which was just kind of a polite thing to do, for a quick dip in the pool. She went in, I went in as well, because it's a polite thing to do. Obviously, my skin doesn't need moistening, but it's an honor, and it's not something that you turn down. Okay, it's just a matter of respect. It's their customs, and so I went in there and just kind of went in and out. And then I went ahead and she showed me to a place where I could, sleep until the morning came. Naturally, I didn't sleep, but I did sit there thinking about things as she retired. I was happy that she was well. I was disappointed that I couldn't touch base with her mother, because her mother had been such an amazing individual. But I got the the feeling that she passed her status on to Rose. There may be some sort of clannishness associated with these types of things. At any rate, I think Rose ended up with her old spot. So the morning came pretty quickly, and she introduced me to some of her offspring, and they were every bit as energy filled and had been raised on some stories about me, and they were pretty joyous. I mean, quite frankly, they were jumping in and out of the pool. Then they'd come up and kind of touch me, and then they'd jump back into the pool, and it was this whole cute little thing. And so she said that the ceremony or of the passing, when in their belief system they came from the ocean, and so they return to the ocean when they have passed. I just wish I had a better word for how they think of it, but I can't think of a better word. They have this awareness that it's not an extinction, and that it's a natural cycle. So I just didn't detect the level of sorrow that we typically give out in situations like that. I don't know whether that's good or it's bad. I mean, I guess it's just different societies dealing with, what is a problem for all mortal beings. And I don't know that their way is any better or worse than any of the way that we handle things. It just is different. So this big ceremony, Rose had got all dressed up and in her green shift, but it had flowers of some sort. They looked like the types of flowers that grow on plants that are in swamps, but she had her dress all decorated with these things, and there was a little bit of a hood that came up over to help protect her face, and the robe itself draped itself over her entire body. The children had smaller versions of this type of clothing, and I think once again they were probably designed for not only fashion and they look nice, but to protect this body, which is still amphibian in nature and requires regular moisture. So with everybody ready, we went ahead and exited onto the street. We started walking, and there was like these little feeder roads that were all leading up to this cliff that was by the ocean. And as I said, their city was by the ocean, and then it had this huge river, kind of like the Nile, which would deliver on a regular basis this huge amount of water, which they would use to fill up their reservoirs and to have their little water celebrations, Return of the Waters. That I mentioned that in the first episode. So as we walked, I started getting more and more attention, and they're fairly polite people. They started croaking. It started getting kind of loud, and I don't want to. I mean, I don't want to insult them by saying croaky. I just don't know what else to say. It sounded kind of like that to me, but it's I'm sure it was a very sophisticated language, which was all I could do is kind of glean telepathic things, and what I got was basically excitement of a newness. Also of a kind of a legendary being, if you will, as much as I hate that whole idea, kind of returning to them. There was also a little undercurrent I noticed of nervousness. I don't know if that's the right word, but I felt it. But whenever you're dealing with feelings, when you're dealing with emotions of creatures that are alien to you, you try your best to turn them into something that you can understand. And I always wonder how close I get. So I don't know. I kind of sensed a little bit of an undercurrent outside of the joyousness that was a little nervous about my existence there. But everybody was very polite. And like I said, the children especially would come over and kind of touch me. The adults were too polite for that, but they were definitely looking at me, and so I was a little bit of a minor celebrity of sorts, I guess, if you want to put it that way. I tried to be the best representative of Earth that I could, and just give them compliments about their their great society and their lovely you know clothing, and as much as I could, being a good diplomat from a faraway civilization. Eventually, we all converged up on this cliff, which was high above the ocean. And I noticed off in front of the whole was the priestly caste, and I could tell they were the priests because they wore they wore whitish type of garments. I don't know if they were somehow dyeing the green away from their clothing, because everybody else was had green, the green sewn clothing, but theirs was white, as if somehow they'd been painted or bleached or whatever. It definitely showed them as a distinct class. I'd had my struggles with them. I mean, just by and large, my personality is not conducive to your strict, fundamentalist, religious type mindset. I try to be as respectful as possible, but in this case, I had to interfere with their a sacrifice ritual. It's just for people who don't remember or didn't bother to go back. In the Return of the Waters ceremony, what they would do is select, it depended, but sometimes as many as 100 or so of the young of the villages. I think it went back to their ancient days when they were much more primitive. When, in order for a family to get away from a threat, sometimes they would leave the youngest member behind to be devoured by the predator while the family escapes. I know that sounds cruel, but if you're in a world where you have to deal with predation and you want to save the family, then the one that is the easiest to sacrifice would be the youngest, because they have yet to survive all the trials yet, and so they haven't gained a lot of talent, or they haven't really done a lot for the tribe. So if you got to sacrifice somebody, that one makes the most sense. I know it sounds a little cruel to us, but if you look at our past history, our history is bloody with plenty of different types of sacrifices. The Aztecs and the Mayans, and if you go back far enough, I think every society had some human sacrifices going on there. That was what I had been sent to address, because they would take these kids and they would cut them all over the place. Then they'd bury them up to their necks in the path of where the waters are to come. So it was a matter of, would they bake to death, would they bleed to death, or would they drown? And I know I'm sounding like I'm very judgmental, and it's a hard thing, just so you know, especially when you start caring about a people, and especially when you have a relationship like I had with that little girl who I named Rose after my own daughter. And I won't spoil it. I won't do a 2-year-old spoiler as to how I solved it, because if you want to go back and actually watch or actually listen to Return to Amphibia, then I don't want to spoil it for you. But just to let you know that I thought I came up with what was a pretty good compromise. At any rate, I kind of saw that the priests were looking at me now, and I sensed an uneasiness coming from them, and it was not at all a positive feeling. I just had the feeling that they wished I wasn't there. But other than that, I didn't get any obvious aggression against me. They started, the priest started singing, and they had a long song. I tried to follow along, but it got into their mythos, and trying to understand or interpret someone's mythos telepathically is even harder than when they're just trying to say, oh, I went into a house that was red. Okay, that's fairly easy from a telepathic standpoint. But when you're trying to get into someone's mythos, where there is understanding upon understanding upon understanding, when somebody in a Christian society mentions Christ's sacrifice, that's all you got to say. Everyone understands exactly what you're talking about because it's part of the Christian mythos. And everybody gets it. You don't, who's in that mythos, so you don't have to explain it. So I think there was a lot of those things happening, which went over my head, quite frankly. But I did get towards the end that they were returning these amphibians to their homes now that their bodies had no longer, functioned. Each of the bodies was rolled up in a almost, it was like a basket, like a large basket, and it was surrounded by, I think it looked to me like their old clothing, and that they kind of covered the basket with their clothing, sort of encircling the whole person. You could kind of see the individual features, but it was hard because it was mostly a complete circle where they had just, covered it with their old clothing. And so each one of these things, and there was about 10 of them, that were at the edge of this, this cliff. And below there was the waters, and they were crashing. And I thought, oh, okay, I guess they're just going to throw them into the water. But before they did that, they started, two of the priests had these enormous horns on either end. That they were whitish orange, and you could tell they must have come from some huge shelled creature from their ocean, because they blew these things like trumpets, like horns, and this sound just echoed over the ocean, and I'll bet you it echoed for miles. Before you knew it, the water was churning, and what I could see was a mass of these kind of hairy, furry snakes that I had previously seen in their Return of the Waters when they had their games. Part of their games was amphibians who were fighting these worm things. These worm things had a pretty good set of jaws on them and fangs. So they're not going to gum you to death. They're going to tear you apart. And so anyway, in the games, they would fight them with a variety of weapons. And, it seemed a little barbaric, a little violent. But once again, you can't judge, or you shouldn't try to judge another civilization. So these particular creatures were now beneath the cliff. I mean, they must have been waiting, or they swam there pretty quickly. And they were, well, it was just like, imagine a bunch of worms just continually moving in and out of the water. And as soon as they appeared, they started pushing these balls with containing the dead body of these amphibians into the water. And as each one hit, the worms would just burst it apart and just rip it to shreds. I mean, I can't come up with any gentler way to say it. It didn't seem to affect the people watching other than me. I was aghast at the whole process, but everyone else seemed cool with it. And the priests were singing, and when the last ball went in, everybody started singing, and I just kind of stood there and sort of psychic hummed along, I guess, trying to take everything in. Eventually, the water quieted because I guess the worms had had their fill. And that was all she wrote. On the walk back, I had mentioned to Rose that I had gotten a weird feeling coming. Maybe I was wrong. I got this weird feeling coming from the priests. And she sort of psychically hushed me, which was weird. She had never done that before. But she indicated that we had to get back to, back to her cavern before they could talk more. So she kind of hushed me, and so we traveled all the way back, and got back into the cavern. The children immediately ditched their robes of green and jumped right into the pool. They didn't seem to be unduly affected by the situation, even though I guess it was by our count, by their grandmother. But they seemed fine with it. I asked Rose how she felt, and I could tell that from her prior contact with me, she kind of got the feeling that I was sad. Like she's very sensitive, just like my daughter. That's why, maybe I did some of the stuff I did on this world for her. But she said that it was nothing that I should worry about. I was a welcome guest here. But there had been a change in their society. Apparently, the gods weren't getting quite the respect that they used to get. People had seen that, well, I don't want to get into details because it'll ruin it for anybody who hasn't seen Return to Amphibia. But they had seen that the changes that I had made, even though I thought they were the most elegant, subtle changes that I could make while preserving life, that it had caused doubt to seep into their society vis-a-vis their religion and their gods. She said that it seemed like more people, especially the younger people, weren't being quite as diligent in the various religious ceremonies and contributions. Why is there always contributions to the gods? Gods are almighty, but they always seem to need money, no matter what planet you go to. At any rate, so there was some stress that had developed in their society, and when I heard this, it felt right to me. It felt like, yes, that was what I was feeling. I bet you these priests were looking at me like I had upset their beautiful little apple cart. And I feel very mixed about the whole situation. But for right now, that's all I want to share on this episode. I might share more, but that's all I want to share for right now. I encourage you, if you want the whole story here, to go back, and I'm going to have 2 links to the prior episodes so that you can see it from A to Z, because it's already run way too long. And if I went into all the descriptions and everything I'd done previously, then we'd end up with an unwieldy episode. So expect more in the future, possibly. I want to see exactly how I should do this. At any rate, that was my 3rd visit to Amphibia and getting to know Rose and her children again. So it was, if you liked it, please hit the like button. Share it with those of like mind. Subscribe if you haven't already. And please, questions and comments, especially on episodes like this. It helps me to determine, what I should spend more time on, what I should talk more about. As I said, since I'd had 2 episodes before, I didn't want to go through a complete repetition, nor did I want to ruin, the big reveal of a 2-year-old episode, Return to Amphibia. So, at any rate, this is Rick, and I will see you on the astral plane.